Welcome to Everything Co-op, bringing you information on how cooperatives can help improve your quality of life. This show is being sponsored by the National Co-op Bank, NCB. The NCB is dedicated to strengthening communities nationwide for the delivery of banking and financial services for the nation's cooperatives, their members, and other socially responsible organizations. For more information on the power of community ownership, visit ncb.coop. That's ncb.coop. Now stay tuned for your host, Vernon Oakes.
Good morning, everybody. This is Vernon Oakes. Welcome to Everything Cooperative. We are absolutely pleased this morning to have Mr. Chuck Snyder, the president of the National Cooperative Bank, who's been sponsoring this program for 6.5 years now, and Mr. Doug OBrien, who's executive director of NCBA, National Cooperative Business Association. That's the umbrella associations of all co-ops in the U.S., but they also work in international and creating co-ops. So right now, we're going to talk about COVID-19. That's the main focus today. So good morning, Chuck and Doug. How are you doing?
Good morning, Vernon.
Hey, good to be with you, Vernon.
It's really good to be with you guys. Thank you very much for taking out time to be with us today. They tell me, a lot of people tell me that they work harder now that they're at home and doing Zooms. How you guys? Are you finding you spending more time working or less time?
I think it's true that I'm working harder working at home. I think that there's just a host of issues that you have to deal with as a result of this COVID, and it's surprisingly how well that the bank is performing, considering everyone is working remotely and using all the IT systems, et cetera, and everything's working out pretty well.
Great. How about you, Doug?
Well, from my end, we've got about 60 or 70 people at NCBA CLUSA that does that domestic cooperative work, advocacy, and public awareness, and then we do development both domestically and across the world. And I agree with Chuck that I'm pleasantly surprised at how effective we can be representing co-ops, getting the word out about co-ops. Of course, there's been a lot of work on advocacy, making sure co-ops are eligible for the different types of economic disaster assistance. Yeah, so it's been very busy. Whether I'm working more hours or not, I don't know. It all just kind of blends, right? I mean, I'm here with the family. I got 3 little kids, and I get to go to recess every day, but it kind of starts off early and it can go pretty late. So.
Well, the good news is you get recess. That was my favorite part of school. That and lunch. Okay. So this COVID-19 is extremely difficult. How are you finding co-ops are doing in this world? I mean, a lot of businesses are closing down. They're not able to open their doors. How are co-ops doing? Which one do you want to start? Chuck, how about you?
Well, okay. Generally, co-ops are doing rather well during this downturn. It's uneven, though. There are some businesses that are impacted more than others. But when you have a general economic downturn like this, it lowers the tide and all boats go down a little bit. So it's not necessarily a positive thing for any of the co-ops, but generally co-ops have done extremely well. If you take a look at our delinquencies, which started out in March at extremely low levels, they have increased a little bit, but we're still, our delinquencies are half of what other commercial banks are experiencing. So, co-ops generally operate in the demand inelastic type services, food, healthcare, housing, financial services like with credit unions, et cetera. And so generally, co-ops have performed pretty well despite, having all these issues.
What about you? Find out with the people?
And like Chuck, I've been talking to folks from the different sectors and co-ops, and generally they've been very resilient. I think performing as well or outperforming others in their sector, and we see some that demand has actually increased in their throughput. I've been talking quite a bit to the food co-op sector, and it's been interesting. At the beginning of this, they had some record demand, and they were really responding to their members' needs and kind of stocking up and preparing for the extended stay at home. since that time, it's really varied across food co-ops. Some continue to do really well, and then others, things have slowed down. The interesting thing about food co-ops, and actually not that surprising, is that they tended to be a lot more aggressive about protecting their workers and coming up with solutions so that the members can still access food, but making sure that the workers can be assured that their health is there. I'm a member of Tacoma Park Silver Spring Co-op up here in D.C., and they have a 100% curbside, and it works fantastic. And I think it's great for the workers. It's great for the members. Yeah, I was checking on some stats yesterday on how the co-op community has been responding here. And, two of the bigger sectors within co-op world is the rural electric co-ops. And many of them, if not most of them, are really working with their customers on those utility bills to make sure that people can, continue to get that affordable, reliable electric service that's so crucial to quality of life. And the credit unions, I just checked their numbers here yesterday, and that nearly 95% of the credit unions surveyed are offering loan modifications right now to their members. 85% of them are waiving at least some fees, and 80% of them created new loan products to meet their member needs. So, co-ops are adapting and making sure that they can continue to meet their mission and serve their members.
Yeah. Doug, that's a real important part, I think, of co-ops. They really care about their community and treat everyone fairly, employees, vendors. You mentioned natural foods co-ops, and in my discussions, one of the things that has helped them out tremendously is that over the years, they have built up personal relationships with farmers close to the store. So not only are they have better access to fresh vegetables and things, but they're also helping their community, keeping the farmers employed, et cetera. And you've heard the stories about farmers having to destroy various different foodstuffs, et cetera, because they just don't have the capability to get it to market. And so, I think co-ops have really showed their value to their community by working those relationships during hard times.
So I've heard flexible, caring about their employees, having relationships with farmers, and really caring about their members. So that's what makes co-ops, I guess, more resilient, I heard you also say. But real quickly, there's 4 types of co-op, 4 sectors. If the co-op is owned and controlled by the employees, it's called a worker co-op. And you can say you have any kind of business if it's owned and controlled by the employees. If it's owned and controlled by the people that uses the products or services, it's called a consumer co-op. And you mentioned rural electric, housing, credit union. Those are all examples of consumer co-ops. And if it's you got farmers use these other 2 a lot, and artists are beginning to use them. And one is called a purchasing co-op, where different farmers get together and create a business that they all buy their products from. And then on the other end, the farmers will create a business where they send their products to, they send their milks to, and then that marketing co-op or producer co-op will add value. They'll make cheese and cottage cheese and all kinds of things and get it to markets that the co-op could not get to. So these are different businesses, and I got a little sense of this, but in downturns, in the previous downturns, the Great Depression, Great Recession, how have co-ops fared? How have they done? Who want to take that one?
Well, Doug. Yeah, I'll start. Generally, they tend to be a lot more resilient, and it's for some of the reasons that Chuck mentioned before, that you mentioned, Vernon, that there tends to be more loyalty. There's a lot more investment. Not only I'm not talking about financial investment, but actual personal investment in the success of the business. And they also tend to be in lines of business that are, as Chuck said, inelastic. I mean, these are electricity, food, housing. These are products or services that people need. And the reason they created the co-op was to solve some kind of problem because the market wasn't filling that need. And that need continues, even in a time of economic, or in this case, also public health crisis. So they do tend to be more resilient. In the Great Recession in 2008, just an example of credit unions, again, how they tended to foreclose on mortgages at a much, much lower rate than private sector banks. And, part of it was because they weren't as as risky in getting involved in some of those funny mortgage products because they were taking the long view. And then the other reason is that their members own and control that financial institution, and so they had every incentive to be as creative as possible to make sure that people, could stay in their homes. And I think we're seeing some of that, that type of creativity and adaptability from co-ops across the different sectors to continue to serve their members.
Vernon, let me add another sector is the small business purchasing cooperatives. And one of the things during this pandemic is that the recession has been very, very hard on small businesses. And many of these small businesses that will survive will be members of co-ops in that they have a supportive structure around their activity. For example, Ace Hardware is a strong co-op. They have some 5,000 member stores around the country owned by entrepreneurs. And, I can't help but think that they benefited significantly from the national advertising that you saw on TV over the last couple of months, et cetera, and their delivery, home delivery product, et cetera, definitely has helped that small business segment. And I encourage all small businesses to take a look at coming together to gain power and strength. If there's one thing that is very disturbing during this pandemic is that the big are getting bigger and stronger and the small are getting weak and going out of business. And that's very concerning to me in that we lose a lot of community. And it's something that small businesses can help themselves through cooperation.
That's a really interesting point, Chuck. As you were talking, I'm going, what would it be like if restaurants in D.C., if all restaurants in D.C. formed a co-op and then they had purchasing, they could buy their things together, and then they would have their different health care for their employees, and they have different systems in place, and how they could work together and work with the community. That would be exciting.
But I'll throw an idea out there with restaurants because they have to close down their dining rooms. They're relying on takeout, and a lot of the delivery services take a very large commission out of the sale of the local restaurant, and couldn't these local restaurants band together and offer some sort of joint delivery, and they wouldn't have to pay that high commission. Just a thought.
Just a thought. There's different ways that we can band together. Listen, we have to take our first break. So we're going to take our first break, and then we'll get back. And I really want to talk when we come back about the mindset, the co-op value system, and how that helped to play to make sure that co-ops stay in business more so than other people. We'll be right back. Please don't touch that dial. Information is power. Yes, it is. That's why National Cooperative Bank has sponsored this program for 6.5 years to give you information about cooperatives and how they function so that you may go find one, research one out to do business with, or you may start your own. Get 3 or 4 people together. If there's some community problem, then you can help create this particular business, work together, and it has a much better chance of being successful. So we have Doug OBrien, who's the Executive Director of NCBA, and Chuck Snyder, the President of the National Cooperative Bank, online with us to give us information about how co-ops are, how they're working within this coronavirus environment. So, gentlemen, when I listen to Governor Cuomo from New York talk, he says things like, we have to be a community. We have to work together. We have to be mutuality and solidarity in order to get through this. And I have it that he's talking co-op. And Northrum is saying the same kinds of things as you have to have the golden rule. The golden rule is do unto others as you have them do unto you. So how does this fit in with this co-op and co-op values? Chuck?
Well, let me just say that, we did have a healthy economy with low inflation and when this whole thing started. But we had significant issues, societal issues that I think co-ops could play a big part in providing solutions. And we all I've heard about the significant wealth gap in the United States, income gap, and that I guess the public discussion has been sort of moved away from some of these societal issues. And I think that as we start to get refocused on rebuilding the economy, I think you're absolutely right, Vernon, that we'll start to focus in on things like affordable housing. You know, here in the district, there's a significant issue with gentrification, and maybe a lot of folks that live in neighborhoods for a very long period of time are getting pushed out. And you know that housing co-ops, once formed, not only provide affordable housing, state affordable housing, but they're not going to go anyplace, and they're not going to get redeveloped, or they're not going to push out folks, et cetera. So, we have to get back to, so some of these societal issues, the sustainability with the environment, are all significant issues that I think co-ops have a solution, which we need not to forget about, and make sure that when we come out of this pandemic, that we're pointed in the right direction and address some of these long-term issues. I think we're getting distracted, and I'm glad we have leaders like Cuomo and Northam that are really keeping us focused on some of the more important things in life.
Yes, I don't want to go back to the normal. That's real quick.
Right.
African-American male, it's clear that the inequities are huge in terms of income and wealth. And the example of wealth, the average white family in the U.S. has a net worth of $171,000. The average black family has $17,000. So the average white family has 10 times more wealth than the average black family. There's a huge history of why that's that, why it's like that.
Right.
And mostly it has to do with different policies. It doesn't have to do with laziness or not wanting or all of that stuff. But Chuck, in talking about limited equity co-ops, I want to give a shout out to Anita Bonds, who's council member for D.C., and she created a limited equity housing co-op, and she has said that limited equity co-ops are the answer to gentrification. I mean, she came up with this as we were doing this work, and then she would kind of like shout that out. So, Doug, what would you say in terms of values? We have the ethical values of honesty in co-ops, openness, social responsibility, and caring for one another. That's that golden rule.
Right.
How do you care for one another? So how do you think that works in this environment, coronavirus, Great Depression, and normal? How does that value system work?
Right. Well, I think it's great. That's a great point, Vernon. You listed some of those values, and we also have the principles. We have the 7 principles of cooperatives that are understood and accepted by the cooperative community across the nation or across the globe. And there's 7 of those, and I'll just want to mention 6 and 7. 6 is cooperation among cooperatives, and 7 is concern for community. These are principles that show up every day with cooperatives, the way that they treat their members, the people in their community. But I think during this COVID experience that we really see co-ops expressing principles 6 and 7. Cooperation among cooperatives. Isthmus Engineering Manufacturing is a worker-owned cooperative in Madison, Wisconsin. They learned about the shortage of personal protective equipment for workers, and they did what good engineers do. They solved the problem. They retooled one of their manufacturing lines and started to create face masks that are so incredibly valuable to healthcare workers. They provided 4,000 masks to home care cooperatives in a very quick order. And, I mean, that was great for the workers. It meant that people could be taken care of in these worker-owned home care cooperatives. It's such a huge piece. I mean, another example, the Cooperative Development Foundation, which is the nonprofit that's affiliated with the National Cooperative Business Association, they put out disaster grants, and they've appealed for resources and have raised over $230,000 from the cooperative community and have been able to put out $230,000 to different home care co-ops primarily, but then to other places. And so it's been, and I want to give that a plug. They continue to seek resources at CDF, CDF.coop, and people can provide them resources and share among the co-op community. There's a lot more examples we don't have time, to get into, but I could sure mention some more about co-ops coming together and really helping each other out and also helping out their communities. I take Chuck's point, I think is really important about this is the moment. There are some things that are really sliding in the wrong direction, racial disparities and so many indicators, wealth inequality. And what my hope is that this COVID experience is actually putting a sharper focus on these problems so that as policymakers and community leaders look for, strategies for the recovery, that they look to co-ops. Co-ops increase community wealth. Co-ops provide people more control and say about their businesses and their community. And that's exactly what we need today. And we've seen this in the past. And I think that we're in another moment like that right now.
Doug, you had mentioned principles 6 and 7, cooperation among co-ops and concern for community. But those were not the main two that I liked when I first got introduced to co-ops. I like number 5, education, training, and information. And I found that's one of the reasons that co-ops stay in existence is because there's this constant training. And I like number 1, again, being African-American, this voluntary and open membership, that it's open to everybody, regardless of your race, religion, gender, where you come from, what your zip code is, what your political or religious. It just doesn't make any difference. It's volunteer. If you want to be a member, you can be a member. And then it's one member, one vote, which is the second one. And this member economic participation, you put some money in to normally a small amount in. And if there's money that's made in profits, you get a portion of that. And you have to have control. That's the 4th, autonomy and independence. So that's why I love co-ops, and I think that's why they exist. Any other thing you want to add, Chuck, about this value system and why co-ops work?
You mentioned public policy. Let me go back a little bit. Public policy hasn't necessarily helped in the wealth gap or income gap, and I certainly agree with that. But hopefully we're pivoting to a new time, and Doug has been a big part of this in advocating fairness and cooperation on Capitol Hill. And we have been advocating for, probably 30, 40 years to have co-ops eligible to participate with SBA programs. And recently, we got the SBA with support of Congresswoman Valdez and Senator Schumer to really pass some legislation that would allow the co-ops to participate in the SBA programs. But I think it'll be interesting to hear from Doug, because he's much more active in this, that the co-op message and the conversation has changed a little bit on Capitol Hill, and we're getting much more willingness on legislators' parts to listen and to actually advocate for co-ops. And recently there was an issue where we got, 7, 8 legislators to submit a letter to the SBA, and that wouldn't have happened a couple of years ago. So, hopefully we're turning the corner on some of these public policy, and I think that we need to push hard to take advantage of this change in attitude.
And we're going to talk about that to the other side of our next break. Doug, when you come back, I'd really like to hear what you've seen as a change. And I just want to give a shout out to Doug and Chuck for really being out there advocating for co-ops and getting that change in policy. We'll be right back. Please don't touch that dial. Welcome back, everybody. This is Vernon Oakes, and the program is Everything Cooperative. The National Co-op Bank has been sponsoring this program for 6.5 years. NCB's mission is to support and be an advocate for America's cooperatives and their members, especially in low-income communities, by providing innovative financial and related services. And we have Mr. Chuck Snyder, the president of NCB, who has been a real fan, not only providing financial support for this program, but also encouragement and ideas and how we can grow. And that's the same thing with Mr. Doug OBrien, who's with the NCBA, the executive director of the National Cooperative Business Association. Before we took break, we said, Doug, we were going to come back and talk to you and see what's happening on the Hill and different things that NCBA and NCB doing is helping the Schumans and the Velasquez and Gillibrand and other people changed their policy to understand co-ops, as FDR did in coming out of the Great Depression. He used co-ops to help come out of the Great Depression. So what's been happening there?
Yeah, well, picking up on Chuck's point before the break, there is increased interest in cooperatives as a solution to some of these challenges that we face as a society. I mean, and I got to say, not only does the National Co-op Bank, support this fantastic show, they've been a stalwart pillar of, moving forward the cooperative message for decades, and a huge part of NCBA, the umbrella organization for cooperatives, and a great partner in our advocacy work. We at NCBA, we've got a congressional cooperative business caucus. There's about 25 members of Congress that are part of this, and it's bipartisan. And I think that's a really important point to make, is that co-ops is not, it's not a Democratic thing or a Republican thing. There is support across the aisle. There's support in rural places with the rural electric cooperatives and agriculture. There's support in urban places with food co-ops, credit unions, and others, and worker co-ops. And so that's, I think, one of the reasons we've had some real success. I think another reason we've had success is that policymakers are kind of desperate for solutions. The way that the wealth inequality has been increasing, that I think that it's so important, greater kind of focus on racial disparities. People are really looking for strategies that empower people in their businesses. And co-ops are tried and true. They've gone to scale in a number of sectors. They really transformed these sectors and some of the geography. And so I think it's really smart that we see these policymakers looking to co-ops. Chuck mentioned the Small Business Administration. Of course, that's in the federal government, the agency that supports small businesses through technical assistance and lending. Historically, they haven't been very warm to cooperatives. They've not embraced the model in the last 2 or 3 years, particularly with the Main Street Employee Ownership Act. But then, in just the last 2 months, as Congress has been looking at economic assistance for small businesses, we've made some great strides in making sure that essentially every kind of co-op is eligible. And we're working hard that they really have access to it. And I actually think it's going to be a pretty big step forward, because there's a lot of the small business kind of community and that agency that's learning about co-ops right now. So that's an important step.
Vernon, I got some interesting news of sort of breaking news here. I just got a email from the Department of Treasury, which announces that they will be setting aside some $10 billion of the PPP funds. That's the payroll protection plan, to be used by community development financial institutions. And a good portion of those CDFIs are credit unions, which are co-ops. And, one of the biggest criticisms of the PPP program was that the money wasn't getting to small businesses that really needed the funds. It was sort of larger companies. And if you had a very small company, maybe you didn't have the sophistication to apply and necessarily have the banking contacts. And these CDFIs serve low-income communities and smaller communities throughout America, both urban and rural. And I think it shows what we're talking about here is that public policy is changing a little bit here, more towards to our way of thinking.
$10 billion, that's great news. $10 billion set aside. Now, Chuck, John Hosclaw from your organization was on 3 or 4 weeks ago, and he was telling that NCB did 247 PPP loans. What was that like?
Well, it was a mad dash because, especially in the first round, because the money ran out so quickly. But, we reached out to our customers as well as the customers that in our community. And, we processed both small and large loans. And, it was very gratifying. In fact, we actually posted a video on our website that shows we got a bunch of thank yous from our customers for processing their PPP loans in good fashion. And we got a lot of thank yous, the videos, and we put them all together and posted it on our website.
I like to look at, yeah.
This PPP program was a good program, but it was hastily put together, and anything that is done with speed
has some gaps, and hopefully, we did the right thing by trying to serve everyone and get it done quickly and in good form, and treat everyone the way that we want to be treated. As you pointed out, the golden rule is so important to us, no matter where they come from.
Okay, now I'd like to talk a bit about Carmen Huertas Noble, a Puerto Rican lady out of New York who's an attorney who teaches. She was on the show, and she said that essential workers are not being treated as if they are essential. And she was saying, well, what would it look like if hospitals were owned by essential workers? And Doug, this goes into all these rural hospitals that are closing and they don't have the capacity for coronavirus. And what would those hospitals look like if they had been owned by the employees there? One hypothesis she made was that they would have had PPEs. They would have been looking out for themselves, for the worker and everything. So how do you see co-ops faring? It's happening on a hill that folks are seeing this as a solution. So how do you see it coming in on the other side of this, and what can we do as cooperators to help folks to really understand, both the public and the policymakers, to see how co-ops can really, really help in all of our different ills?
Yeah, so, Carmen, and one of the reasons I know you had her on is because she's an inductee to the Hall of Fame this year. So it's really great that you had her, the Cooperative Hall of Fame that CBF does. A couple points on this. Number one, how would those frontline workers be treated if they were a co-op? And we have some examples. I mean, we know that food co-ops are treating their workers with much more caution and with their workers' health in mind than non-co-ops. We know that the credit unions they're doing a lot of the same thing. We're seeing examples of people treating not only their workers but other stakeholders with more caution, with those people's health really in mind. You talk about rural. You mentioned there's a lot of small businesses, like Chuck was talking about before. One of the big tragedies in this situation is that a lot of small businesses are, even with the good programs of PPP and some other programs, but people are predicting that a lot of small businesses are going to go out of business, and whether that's in urban communities or rural communities, you lose some of your key small businesses, and you really lose the fabric of that community. A small town loses its grocery store or its hardware store. That can be really devastating. Something we've been talking a lot about. It's kind of an old solution and a new glove, and that's small business conversion. So what if that mom and pop of that grocery store in a small town, if they convert that grocery store to ownership by the workers or ownership by the consumers? So you convert it into a co-op. And we know that, about 10 million people will be changing, they're going to be transferring their business over this next 5 to 10 years. And now I think, like so many things with COVID, that's being accelerated. And so people are looking for solutions on what to do with their small business so that those communities can survive. And co-ops, I think, are just a fantastic solution. We need some more public policy to be able to go with scale at that. So we're starting a conversation about how do we do that as Congress looks at some future legislation on recovery from the COVID economic downturn.
So Papa Sin works for NCBA CLUSA, and he was on the show the first month. We were only going to do this show for 1 month, and that was the month of October 6.5 years ago. And he was on, and he said something. Papa Sin is from Senegal, and he said that we pay taxes with anticipation of what those tax dollars would do for the community. And I have never thought about, I always thought about taxes as just a burden, okay, that you got to do it. But anticipation. So if we took our tax dollars and we could tell the policymakers, we want you to put some of those tax dollars into helping these owners who are, a lot of them are my age, they're the baby boomers. I think they said 75% of business owned by baby boomers. And so that they are looking to what they do. And now this coronavirus has come in. A lot of these won't start back up. But what if we took our tax dollars and helped those employees own the business, run the business, control the business, whether it's in rural or urban settings, that perhaps more of these business will come back on and come back on faster and survive, be successful. Chuck, what do you think about that?
Well, I think it's one of the strong solutions that co-ops have to offer going forward. I think there's a lot of interest in this on Capitol Hill as far as coming up with supportive policies. You know, I think that everyone is looking for stability in their life, and there's a lot of gig workers and contractors, et cetera. That has definitely grown in percentage. And how do you get into a situation where it's more stable and there's more fringe benefits like healthcare, et cetera? And they also have a say in how things are run as well. And I think that worker co-ops definitely provide solutions for all those issues. So, you know, I see, you know, co-ops playing a significant, role going forward. One of the things that has come up with working at home with the pandemic is do we have enough broadband in the
Yes.
right places? And rural utilities, I think rural utility co-ops, which have a large market share, they cover 75% of the country in geographic area, really is in a great position to help provide that broadband to rural areas, because you don't get past go these days if you can't get on the internet highway. Public policy is so important in that, because it's going to be so expensive. But we can't let these rural communities fall behind because we're not providing the proper infrastructure.
75% of the households, 75% of the land mass, the electricity is provided by rural electric co-ops. And that means those people that have those meters, they own that business. And they get to vote for the board of directors or run for the board, and they have to set the policies that are for themselves. And so it works, and it's worked a lot. And this came out of FDR and the Great Depression, and how, because the normal capitalist business wouldn't put money into this rural because it costs too much to run the lines in the capital.
That's right.
So
Right.
They work, and they work really, really well. We're going to take our final break, and I'd like to come back and continue this conversation of what's the co-op role after this pandemic, and looking at what we can do. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everybody. This is Vernon Oakes, and the program is Everything Cooperative. We have Mr. Chuck Snyder, president of NCB, on the line with us, and Mr. Doug OBrien, the executive director of the Cooperative Business Association. We're talking now about what happens after this coronavirus is over. Once we have a vaccine and testing and all of that stuff that we need, what would the new norm look like? And I want to give a shout out, gentlemen, to Dr. Jessica Gordon-Imhard, and ask everybody out there to get her book, Collective Carriage, because in that book, she talks about particularly history between African Americans in this co-op. And there's a huge history. And in that book, she talks about that after 5 years, a cooperative business, like 90% of those businesses are still in existence. And if you have a capitalistic business, after 5 years, only 10 or 20% of those businesses are still in existence. And one of the reasons are all of the things that we've just talked about: the flexibility, the training, the working together, the loyalty, having the whole community supporting each other. And it takes longer to get a cooperative business started most of the time because of all of that training and learning how to solve issues when there's issues. And you have two or more people, you're going to have conflict. How do you solve that conflict? So all of these different reasons co-op work. So what can we do to get the word out even more than what we're doing, so that policymakers and the general public knows about co-ops as an answer to a lot of these ills that we find in our community? Chuck, why don't you start off with that one?
Sure. You know, this is sort of a once in a lifetime, event. You know, the last pandemic was 100 years ago, and this recession is going to be much greater than any recession that we've had since the Great Depression. You know, the Great Recession was a significant event 10 years ago, but for example, the high of unemployment was close to 10%. I think it was sort of 9% or so. Some areas were much greater. But we have already had the job losses this time around 2 or 3 times more than we had 10 years ago. So the impact is going to be similar to that of the Great Depression. Now, I don't predict a depression. I think we'll have a recovery here. It's going to be a little bit slower than I think that everyone is anticipating. I think the stock market is way ahead of itself. But the reason why I'm saying this is that there's an opportunity, just like in the Great Depression, to sort of reassess things and come up with a lot of new ideas. For example, the rural electrics were created as a result of rethinking things after the Great Depression. I think the Civil Rights Movement, there was a lot of things that the seeds were planted after the Great Depression to set things up, and it was because of sort of the inequities got highlighted. There was a desire for new thinking, et cetera. So I think that from the country standpoint, there's an opportunity for us to think big and to do new things, and I think co-ops definitely will play a part in it. We talked about some of those opportunities, whether it's broadband, housing co-ops, especially in the inner city, small business co-ops, coming together to survive the next downturn, worker co-ops, so that you can have a living wage and can control the environment and be your own boss and have that power to serve the community. I just think that the world has seen sort of the large companies get larger, and I think that this new thinking will challenge some of the things that have been happening, and I think it's going to open up for policy change, hopefully, to support some of these cooperative activities, just like what happened in the aftermath of the Great Depression.
Thank you, Chuck. What about you, Doug?
I completely agree with Chuck. A couple other data points that just shows how I think the moment is right. Number one, I read last week that 40% of the people with incomes of $40,000 or less have lost their jobs in the last 2.5 months.
What percent of that?
40% of people with less than $40,000 in income. Such a huge swath. And Chuck talked about the stock market ahead of itself. April was the best month since, I think, 1987 or something, in a very, very long time. At the same time, when all these people were losing jobs, I mean, that disparity between, systems that are really working good for outside investors and systems that are not working good for low-income households and people of color. I mean, now I think people are going to be really more interested in some solutions. And like Chuck was talking about, Vern, you talk about, co-ops are a proven way to bring more wealth into the community, to solve the problems that the people want to solve, with businesses. So, again, it's looking at those past successes and applying it today. It's saving small businesses. It's looking at gig workers. That's another thing as we've moved to really accelerated our commerce online. We really need, and there's been, a lot of conversation in the last 5 or 10 years with platform cooperatives, but now's the time that we've got to sharpen our pencils to get some policies in place so more people can have control of this internet space. So those are just a couple examples.
Yeah, it really shows that when you have 3 people in the U.S. that owns the same wealth as the bottom 50% of the people. So you take 50%, half of 330 million people. You add up all of the wealth that they have, and you got 3 people that have more wealth. There's something wrong in the system, particularly when you look at the outcomes for those low-income people in terms of health disparities. And one group is the native nations, like the Navajo Nation is now experiencing huge coronaviruses in their world. Coronavirus is really affecting them. And how do we go in and help those people too? And then some reservations. I think there are co-ops that are working, both housing and for low income. But how do we then get to where we really get the policymakers and our country to understand? Because, Chuck, I think you said at the United Nations in 2011, or either United Nations or on the Hill, you said that co-ops are one of the best kept secrets in the U.S. So how do we get this knowledge out? And this is why we started this program, to get knowledge out about this. How we even do it more, take this opportunity to really get people to understand co-ops.
Well, that's one of my great frustrations with co-ops, and that co-ops tend to focus in towards their members and not towards the general public. So, and there's good and bad for that. Credit unions have been growing, double digits here for the last decade. Their growth has slowed down a little bit here in the last year or two, but it's still been much stronger than the banks. But as far as understanding of credit unions, et cetera, there's still sort of a lack. And that's I'm not picking on credit unions. I'm picking on the entire cooperative sector across the board. We've had, some 150 housing co-ops here in the district that have performed very well. But it's not widely known that they provide, great affordable housing. And, they've been here for a long time. I just saw a video here, housing co-ops in the district. We're celebrating its 100th anniversary here in the district. And, probably 100 people know that. And, that's one of the things that going forward, co-ops, we need to be more vocal and to our predecessors working in co-ops, I think, have done a much better job of promoting co-ops to the general public and to the Capitol Hill. But, I think that over the last 10, 20 years, we've been probably swimming upstream a little bit. Capitalism has created a lot of wealth, not necessarily equal wealth, but has created a lot of wealth across the nation. And I think that, we've gotten sucked up into sort of a celebration of capitalism. But what's happened is that we've gotten such concentration, lack of diversity. All of a sudden we have sort of international type conglomerates that just don't care about the communities like a small business would, or a co-op would, about their society or their little community. So we need to do a better job.
I totally agree with Chuck. What we've got to do is really show how the outcomes. There's the wealth outcome, but there's also the different societal outcomes and community outcomes. And we're doing that work at NCBA CLUSA, measuring co-ops and telling that story in a different way. And then co-ops need to stand on top of the roof and tell that story. There's no doubt about it. It's such a great story, and it's so needed these days.
You've got the last word, Doug. We need to get on the roof and shout it. Shout it out. Okay.
There we go.
Thank you guys for being on the show. Everybody out there, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Vernon.
And please live this week cooperatively and think about joining a co-op or starting one.
All right. Thanks, Vernon.
Have a great one, dear. Take care. Bye now.